Welcome to the webinar discussion and report launch on reforming multilateralism to support pandemic response policies, hosted at Boston University Global Development Policy Center. Thank you for joining us today at a time when the world is looking at an urgent crisis in the Ukraine, and our thoughts are with the Ukrainian people. We hope for a rapid solution. We wanted to acknowledge this important world event before we focus on the topic of today's seminar. The Boston University GDP Center is a university-wide research center that works in advance of policy-oriented research for financial stability, human well-being, and environmental stability across the globe. In 2018, the GDP Center established a working group on trade treaties and access to medicines. A dynamic group of economists, legal scholars, medical scientists, and policy analysts from around the world to advance an evidence-based understanding of the impacts of trade and investment treaties on access to medicines. My name is Veronica Wirtz. I'm a member of this working group on trade treaties on access to medicines and a professor at the Department of Global Health at the School of Public Health, Boston University. With the 2-year anniversary of the COVID-19 pandemic, the global pandemic response has suffered many significant setbacks. The World Trade Organization, WTO 12th Ministerial Conference has been postponed twice with no definite date set, and the proposed waiver of its intellectual property rights that should allow and promote the widespread of production of COVID-19 vaccines has stalled. The World Health Organization has struggled years after funding cuts and competing agendas by different member states. And the pandemic has led to go-it-alone policies by many governments and revealed a multilateral system that seems no longer fit for purpose. To examine the extent and the nature of these problems, a recent report by Boston University GDP Center examines the question, to what extent do the trade and investment rules constrain policy making that countries implemented during the pandemic? The study found that constraints of multilateral rules contribute to worsening health policies and ran counter to measures to stabilize economies. Given these findings, we would like to discuss today how should international rules be reformed to support rather than constrain public health? What reforms are needed at multilateral level, institutions like the WTO and the International Monetary Fund? And should government actions to support human well-being, social equity, and the environment be seen as of higher order than commercial protection, and as such, exempt from challenges under global agreements? Working group members and report co-author Rachel Thrasher and Sandra Polaski join us today to present findings and policy recommendations for reforming multilateralism to support pandemic responses. Rachel Thrasher is a research fellow for the Global Economics Governance Initiative at Boston University GDP Center. She holds a JD and a master's degree in international relations, both from Boston University. She works on policy issues related to trade and investment agreement, policy space for development, intellectual property, and access to medicines, and also the climate impact of trade and investment treaty. She is the co-author of the 2021 book, Constraining Development, the shrinking policy space in the international trade regime. And we have Sandra Polaski. She's a non-resident senior research scholar for the Global Economic Governance Initiative at the GDP Center. She's an expert on trade, labor, social policy issues on national and global level. Previously, she served as a Deputy General Director for Policy of the International Labour Organization from 2012 to 2016, and as the ILO Sherpa for the G20. Earlier, she was the US Deputy Undersecretary of Labor in charge of International Labour Affairs Bureau, and before that, she directed the Trade Equity and Development Program at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We also are joined today by two renowned experts who will offer their reactions and insights into the report. Ronald Lambonte, a distinguished research chair in globalization and health equity, and professor in the School of Public Health and Epidemiology at University of Ottawa. His research focused on health equity impacts of diverse globalization processes, many of which form the content of his recent book, Health Equity in a Globalizing Era, the Oxford University Press, and awarded the Medical Book of the Year by the British Medical Association in 2021. He is the editor-in-chief of the BMC journal Globalization and Health, active with the People's Health Movement, a frequent contributor to its flagship publication Global Health Watch, and a co-editor of its forthcoming 6th edition. And then we have Carlos Correa. He's the executive director of South Center and a renowned international authority on intellectual property and technical issues. He has previously worked for the Argentine government and served as director of the Center for International Studies on Industrial Property and Economics at the Law Faculty of the University of Buenos Aires. He was also a member of the UK Commission on Intellectual Property Rights and the Commission on Intellectual Property Rights, Innovation and Public Health, established by the World Health Assembly, and of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN Panel of Eminent Experts on Ethics in Food and Agriculture. Professor Correa is both a lawyer and an economist from the University of Buenos Aires and holds a PhD in law from the University of Buenos Aires. I'm extremely pleased to have you all here for our discussion and looking forward to the audience questions. Before turning it over to our panelists for presenting the report, I wanted to mention a few housekeepings. The webinar is live streamed on YouTube, so the recording is immediately available. Please use the question and answer box located in the Zoom menu to ask your questions, and we really welcome your questions. Please also give your name and affiliation. We will take questions after the panelists' remarks, but feel free to enter the question at any time during the discussion. With this, thank you, and now hand it over to Rachel and Sandra.
Thank you, Veronica, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. We are very excited and grateful to be sharing our research and findings with you and look forward to your questions and comments as we go along, in particular at the end. First of all, I wanted to make sure to note that our co-authors in this research, Warren Kaplan is an assistant professor of global health at Boston University School of Public Health, and core faculty member at the GDP Center, together with Veronica Wirtz, our moderator today, and fellow professor at the School of Public Health and core faculty at the center. They guided and supervised our excellent graduate research assistants, Louise Clear and Shiva Priya Budaluri, in gathering the data and making sense of the trends in government policy making. As Veronica mentioned already, the question we sought to answer in our research was, to what extent could the trade and investment rules constrain policy making that countries consider important or necessary during a pandemic? I'll begin by describing our data gathering and analysis methodology and providing an overview of the relevant trade rules we found might interfere with policy-making patterns. I'll complete my portion by presenting our findings with respect to the policy interventions, and then I'll pass it off to Sandra. So we began our research by downloading policy intervention data from the Global Trade Alert, the GTA database, which was created by Simon Evenet and colleagues at the GTA. We collected data on certain measures, particularly those considered harmful or discriminating or likely harmful or discriminating, implemented after March 1st, 2020, and focused in on 6 countries whose actions were determined to be systemically significant: the United States, France, Germany, China, India, and South Africa. We then placed the interventions in buckets according to the relevant trade rules which would govern them. We focused on the WTO in particular, because those rules were the most broadly applicable and due to increased interest in WTO reform from a wide array of governments and interest groups.
Next slide, please.
We then no, that's fine. Where we are is, oh yes, we're on research approach, sorry. We then describe how the trade rules prescribe or govern those policy interventions by describing the relevant rules, and finish by proposing some policy recommendations. Yeah, next slide, yes. This image highlights some of the major ways that the WTO rules place constraints on policymaking. Generally speaking, the rules we looked at either 1, govern the kind and process of providing subsidies covered by the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, and the Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures, or 2, limit import and export barriers, that is usually prohibiting them outright under the GATT, 3, demand that investment measures do not act as barriers to trade or backdoor ways to discriminate against foreign products under the Agreement on Trade-Related Investment Measures. 4, for some countries, place constraints around domestic government procurement practices, the Plurilateral Government Procurement Agreement. And 5, place constraints around the process of issuing compulsory licenses for access to medicines, or rather important innovations, under the Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights. Each of these rules allows some limited exceptions, which may play a role in governments defending these measures in cases where it comes up in the future. I do want to flag that although we focus on the WTO and the rules there, rules in bilateral and regional free trade agreements often ratchet up those standards, putting even greater constraints on government policymaking. Next. Of the 5 basic trade rule constraints we looked at, 4 were directly correlated to policy categories in the GTA data set. This table is a list of all the GTA policy categories that came up during the year and a half that our research covers. And as you can see, the countries in our study deployed quite a diverse set of policies over that time period. I do want to briefly mention that the GTA does not include a category for intellectual property measures. So we gathered that information from the World Intellectual Property Organization's COVID-19 IP policy tracker. We found there that only 2 of our countries, France and Germany, made changes to their policy regimes to make compulsory licenses easier to use during that time. And while there is an interesting story to tell about the use, or more commonly the lack of use, of compulsory licensing for access to medicines, it exceeds the scope of our comments right now. Perhaps we can get into that story a bit more during the discussion time. Next slide. We divided our analysis in part by the sectors of the economy that these measures impacted. We focused first on the measures that were aimed at or had an impact on health sectors, which we defined as a combined grouping comprised of 9 individual sectors, and you can find those sectors listed in the report. And then we looked at policies aimed at more general economic goals. Next slide. This table provides an overview of our quantitative findings across 6 countries. At a glance, what we see is that the US was the most actively interventionist country with 476 policy interventions, while China and South Africa enacted relatively few new trade policies during the time. It's also particularly notable, and you can go to the next slide for this, that only 1/10 to 1/3 of all interventions were aimed at health sectors, specifically during the pandemic. While India was the most likely to target their health sector with policy interventions. Next slide. Consequently, the vast majority, 2/3 to 90% of policy interventions were aimed at non-health sectors, with the purpose of boosting local sectors and industries, stabilizing economies, and easing supply chain bottlenecks. We'll discuss those more general policies in a few moments. Next slide. This chart breaks down the distribution of policy types for each country. And what it shows is that in general, China, India, and South Africa relied more heavily on trade restrictions. That's the dark gray section, while the high income countries in our study relied primarily on subsidy-based measures, the black section. And we think that this is likely because they had more fiscal and monetary space to do so. We may talk about that again in a moment. So let's focus for a moment just on the health sector interventions. Next 2 slides down. This chart is helpful in that it breaks down the diversity of health policy interventions by each country. What we notice immediately is that while the United States implemented by far the most individual policies, almost 3 times as many as India overall, India implemented by far the most diverse set of policies in terms of their typologies under the GTA, using almost half of possible policy types just in their effort to improve health outcomes during the pandemic. Next slide. A few examples from these health policies will help sort of just demonstrate the contours of these interventions. So it's well known that many countries poured money into research and development for vaccines early in the pandemic. India supported the Serum Institute and others. The European Investment Bank provided loans to BioNTech, and the US through the NIH and BARDA supported Moderna in research collaboration and financial support. What is less well known, next slide, are some support policies that South Africa included provided funding for businesses buying essential supplies for COVID-19 treatment, emergency funding for Black-owned businesses seeking to fight COVID-19. All of these, both the research and development support and these other funding supports, would be considered subsidies under the WTO's agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures and would be regulated as such. In addition to supporting the development and purchase of COVID-19 products, many countries deployed various means to keep products in their country that would otherwise be exported. The most infamous being India's compulsory domestic sale of vaccines, but many other countries did this as well, including more subtle introduction of export licensing requirements for key COVID products or a full-on ban of PPE export in Germany. Similarly, many countries attempted to control investment in the critical sectors, such as Germany and France introducing foreign investment screening mechanisms. India introduced local content requirements for firms producing medical coveralls. While usually these kinds of measures are efforts to increase domestic investment or manufacturing, here, given the short-term need for these products and the urgency of the situation, they're likely to have been more focused on retaining domestic supply in case where imports were not sufficient to meet demand. Finally, in addition to supporting health sectors directly through subsidies, countries had to purchase pharmaceutical products directly with those procurement agreements, and they usually came with strings attached. So the EU required the purchased vaccines to be produced locally in agreements with AstraZeneca and CureVac, and India introduced similar rules for medical devices. These interventions represent another effort to retain control over what had become a global value chain that was hard to predict or rely on. So the next set of measures we looked at were those that affected non-health sectors. And I'll go through some examples here as well. Next slide. So subsidies for the non-health sectors came in roughly two forms. Broad-based economic support, for example, for job retention across industries was very common, and probably because its general application would not contravene subsidies rules at the WTO. On the other hand, specific subsidies, such as those aimed at domestic airline firms, which was common in 4 of our 6 countries, would be much more suspect under trade rules. The extensive use of subsidies during the pandemic builds on a longer history of that use, as a recent GTA report shows that the EU and the US each on average deployed more subsidies than China between 2008 and 2021. This contradicts the idea that subsidies are found only or primarily in non-market economies, and we'll return to that point in a few moments when we talk about recommendations. In addition to subsidies, the US and China both introduced import licensing requirements, next slide, and other import restrictions on strategic products, such as aluminum and bulk power systems. And while these measures could have been counteracting economic impacts of the pandemic, they were also a response to geopolitical concerns. And you could say the same about many of the foreign investment policies. Investment measures took the form of revisions of foreign investment review policies, which countries may have been seeking to address economic vulnerability, but also were aimed at geopolitical concerns. It's also important to note here that there's an extensive web of international investment agreements, including FTAs, that give strong rights to investors to challenge government policies and even public health measures. So our report notes examples of private law firms that are reported to be exploring or soliciting suits against governments for health and other actions taken during the pandemic. Finally, the bulk of government procurement measures, you can forward a few slides. The bulk of government procurement measures took place in the pharmaceutical and health sectors, but 2 countries in our study introduced new local content rules in public procurement. The United States expanded its Buy America rules to new infrastructure projects, and India buttressed its support of the defense sector with local procurement rules as well. With that, I will pass the next discussion off to Sandra.
Thank you, Rachel. Yes, the measures taken by the governments, as Rachel pointed out, reflect the tension with a number of the trade and investment rules, but they also reflected other tensions and trade-offs that they chose to make. And we want to focus on some of those other trade-offs, not least because they inform our proposals about the kind of policy changes that would be necessary to have a better response to crises in the future. We point out three main axes along which these trade-offs occurred. First was the tension between national and global level health needs. By its nature, the COVID-19 pandemic crossed borders, fueling wave after wave of illness and death around the globe. From a purely scientific perspective, the only successful approach to end the pandemic is at the global level. And from an ethical perspective, of course, all humans should have access to the prevention and treatments available. However, governance occurs at the level of the state, with national governments and in some places subnational governments being the only entities with both the legal authority and the practical ability to respond. By contrast, there is no global government, and existing institutions at the supranational level, such as the WHO, lack both the authority to mandate responses by individual countries and the means to deliver sufficient public goods themselves. The second dimension along which policymakers face trade-offs is between public and private interests. The private sector's interests include increasing returns to shareholders, increasing market share, and maximizing profits. The overwhelming public interest in a pandemic is in limiting the spread of the disease and preventing death. As national level governments sought to acquire needed personal protective equipment, medicines, and vaccines, private sector providers typically sold them to the highest bidder, which increased overall costs for dealing with the pandemic and also favored well-resourced governments over lower income countries. And even among high-income countries, governments that offered higher purchase prices were often prioritized for delivery by the private for-profit suppliers. The third dimension of trade-offs is between the need for efficiency in creating COVID-19 products and their equitable availability. Some economists argue that the incentives facing the private sector lead to efficiency gains that yield greater overall supply and therefore the possibility for greater overall distribution. However, this argument is undermined by studies over the last 30 years that have shown that overall, the private sector underinvests in research and development to address pandemics or illnesses that plague low-income countries because the return on investment is uncertain or not high enough to be profitable. And with regard to the role of intellectual property protections in incentivizing research on new treatments and vaccines, excessively long protection of intellectual property can actually discourage new research and innovation, as pharmaceutical companies are able to continue to collect rents defined as excess profits that can be realized in the absence of competition from earlier research, as long as the patent protection lasts and generic producers are prevented from competing with them. In the current pandemic, a specific critique targets for-profit corporations that have withheld intellectual property, such as patents, trade secrets, and production methods, from vaccine-producing firms in other countries in order to maintain scarcity of supply and therefore maintain high prices. Next slide, please. So the evidence in our study makes clear that during the pandemic, these 6 countries chose to disregard constraints on their policies that could arise from the rules of the WTO or under other trade and investment agreements in order to deal with the health and economic crisis at hand. So what lessons can we take from this experience to improve trade and investment policies for a better response to future crises? We propose reforms in 3 baskets. The first basket contains short-term steps to end the current pandemic. First, we recommend that members of the WTO should negotiate and come to an agreement to waive key provisions of the Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, the TRIPS agreement, for COVID-19 related products. Now, this is an issue which has already been mentioned by Veronica and by Rachel, and I expect that Ronald and Carlos will have something to say, as they have both followed this issue and published on it very closely, and we'll come back to it. Second, we recommend that high-income countries should require private sector producers to share their technology and know-how with manufacturers in low and middle-income countries in order to increase supply. Now, how can they do this? They can leverage their financial and scientific contributions that they already made to the development of vaccines and medicines. For example, the extensive US support given to Moderna and the German, US, and EU support given to BioNTech and Pfizer. And they can also use their leverage as buyers of very large quantities of these products to push the producers in that direction. I think it's worth taking a moment to note here that in the Moderna case, the company sought an exclusive patent on its vaccine, on its mRNA vaccine, by denying the key role that had been played by US government health researchers in the development of the vaccine. This suggests that at a minimum, future public funding of research into essential public health goods should come with a requirement to waive patents. And third, low and middle income countries should support domestic development and reverse engineering of innovative technologies with the support of organizations such as the WHO. A good example of this is the work by researchers at a South African biotechnology company to reverse engineer Moderna's vaccine without Moderna's involvement by using publicly available research and data on the vaccine and with important support from the WHO's Technology Transfer Hub, which was created to build capacity for vaccine manufacturing in low and middle income countries. And another good example is a vaccine developed by two researchers at Baylor College of Medicine who are making it available patent-free so that it can be produced by any vaccine maker in a low and middle income country. And this is already happening in India, and the vaccine is also licensed for production in Bangladesh, South Africa, and Botswana. Next slide, please. Our set of proposals that aims to build long-term health resilience includes a proposal that WTO members and also members of other trade and investment agreements should negotiate to expand policy space for building adequate domestic health sectors in each country. Why is this necessary? Because countries that attempt to build up long-term health resilience by supporting their domestic health industries will find themselves constrained by trade rules that do not allow them to give preference to domestic producers or cause injury to incumbent industries in other countries. The more successful they are in launching new or expanded domestic industries, the more likely they are to become mired in lengthy and costly legal disputes. Second, regional groups should collaborate to create structures for regional production hubs. And this will be needed because many small countries, particularly low-income small countries, would find it difficult to become producers of vaccines and many other health products. And of course, work will also be needed at the country level, which is our third point here. Next slide, please. No, go back. Yes. Long-term economic stability, equity, and adaptation. These proposals go to the non-health measures that were taken, although they also include reforms that would have an effect on health measures. We have two main recommendations in this basket, addressing the need to facilitate economic development, equity, and resilience worldwide. First, members of the WTO should seek to negotiate greater recognition of the primacy of public welfare goals, including health, equity, environmental, and development goals in the rules of the WTO. Specifically, the WTO Exclusions Clause, Article 20, should be expanded to more explicitly recognize the primacy of these matters over commercial interests and should make them exempt from challenge under the agreement. And countries should similarly seek to revise the rules of their other trade and investment agreements to expand their policy space to act in the public interest. The supply chain disruptions and the scarcity of essential goods that we observed during the pandemic highlighted a lack of resilience and reduced competition in the global economy. Those were not accidental side effects of the current regime. They were the logical result of the precedence that's given to private commercial interests in trade and investment rules. And this must be rebalanced. Finally, countries that are parties to investment or trade agreements with investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms, ISDS, should either renegotiate or withdraw from them to restore the balance between public and private interests in international economic law. Before the pandemic, a number of governments, as different as India, the European Union, and the United States, had started to recognize the extreme imbalance between private and public interests underlying the ISDS arbitration mechanisms, and had already taken some steps to revise investment treaties or limit access to such mechanisms under newer trade agreements. These reforms should continue with greater urgency. We recognize that all of these proposed reforms are highly ambitious, but if we aim to protect human health and well-being, to achieve greater social equity, and to protect the planet, then the current system of trade and investment rules will have to be rebalanced. Let me add, as already has been mentioned, that the pandemic has also reinforced shortcomings of, or the obviousness of shortcomings of other key multilateral institutions, including the IMF. Our colleague Kevin Gallagher and Richard Kozel-Wright of UNCTAD have just published a book, The Case for a New Bretton Woods, which lays out changes to the IMF and the trade and investment regime to make the institutions fit for the 21st century. Next slide, please. Our PowerPoint, which will be available to you on our website, includes a list of resources that you see here, which go deeper into many of the issues that we've addressed, including work by our discussants today, Ronald and Carlos. These resources are in addition to the very extensive list of references that you'll find in our report. With that, let me close and hand it back to you, Veronica.
Thank you so much, Sandra and Rachel, for this excellent presentation of the report. We have made the URL link to the report available in the chat. And now I would like to hand it over to Ronald Labonte to make some remarks and reflections about the report. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Let me begin by sort of basically saying that pretty much as the report and the discussion that we've heard so far on the report, I think is the most comprehensive analysis of how the WTO, some of the governments have responded in relationship to the pandemic. And I think it correctly points out right at the outset how the normative intent of trade, which was, full employment, rising living standards, sustainable use of resources, et cetera, that was really the penumbra, the launch of the Marrakesh Agreement. But that's unenforceable. Yet all of the liberalizing rules within trade agreements are. So I think it's important for us to remember the context in which the WTO came to exist, and that these agreements were reached in the early decades of the neoliberal era. So in some respects, unless governments are prepared to reject the basic tenets of neoliberalism and embrace at least some aspects of the neo-Keynesian economics, the prospect of reform and the very important recommendations that the report makes could be somewhat limited. Now, in terms of how the report talks about the basic trade and investment related measures that many governments undertook during the pandemic, to my mind, they really have two types. And the first directs public funding inwards to shore up their domestic pharma industries or their health industries, associated supporting sectors. And the report does a very good job of referencing all of that, or to restrict export of essential health goods. And these were very much direct, protectionist, and nationalist responses to pandemic risks. Now, the second type, the subsidies to domestic interests or industries, the Buy Back America procurement policies of infrastructure funding in the US, these are really more about domestic politics. And I consider these a kind of a neo-mercantilism that really seems intent on positioning a country's economy to emerge more powerful and competitive in a post-pandemic global economy. And it's, I think, in this second type of measure that the pandemic, COVID-19, really provided a very useful fog or smoke screen. I think, as all of us know, that really the most stunning failure to date has been the lack of support to the TRIPS waiver or to demanding technology transfer and knowledge sharing. It's really the most egregious inactions on the part of several high-income countries. And I think it's also useful to remember that the bulk of the TRIPS agreement was largely drafted by the then head of the US-based Pfizer Corporation and lodged in the WTO treaties at American behest. So there's kind of an industrial interest that lies behind this particular agreement. Now, the arguments that we heard from pharma against the waiver, that primarily that low and middle income countries lack the ability, so even voluntary licensing is second best compared to continued monopoly control, those have been proved wrong, as Sandra pointed out, in terms of the reverse engineered modern Moderna mRNA vaccine in South Africa. But without the waiver, pharma could potentially block further mRNA developments in low and middle income countries. And even though we may have at least an adequate intellectually protected supply of COVID vaccines by the middle of this year, whether or not they're distributed is another question. But even if we might achieve that, we still have long-term unanswered questions about how are we going to cope with future pandemic risk? How are we going to cope with the novel therapeutics that might be coming online in terms of dealing with an endemic form of SARS-CoV-2? Now, I'm also embarrassed by my own government's stance on the waiver, with arguments that the current TRIPS amendments, the article bis 31 bis, that they were sufficient, when clearly they were not. And ironically, Canada, which early on in the pandemic actually amended its compulsory licensing to sort of allow that to occur and then let it lapse as it decided instead through advanced purchase agreements, it's going to become number one of the rich country vaccine hoarder nations. Canada refused for over a year to amend its own patent act to allow an export-oriented compulsory license from Canada to Bolivia for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And there's some speculation that this reluctance actually reflects threats from other vaccine manufacturers that moving COVID vaccines into this category eligible for licensing could delay further shipments under further advanced purchase agreements. So we don't, and those agreements have never really been made fully public. So we don't know exactly what the extent of the collaboration was between the pharmaceutical interests and what governments were trying to manage in terms of very quickly getting access. So in summary, I mean, we know the waiver and the requirements for technology and transfer knowledge sharing remain fundamentally important, if not for the current pandemic, that's certainly for the next one, and absolutely so as we move forward into post-pandemic crises of climate change and new risks of zoonosis. And I think this point was strongly made in the first policy brief produced by the WHO Commission on the Economics of Health for All. And that kind of adopted Mariana Mazzucato's mission economy metaphor and really chided on how governments could have and should have placed all kinds of conditionalities on their financial supports and guarantees to vaccine manufacturers. Not the procurement ones, which were really still mercantilist in nature, but more around the global equity. And the report makes also similarly makes the same point. Now, this doesn't mean, and this is again, I think a really useful point that the report covers off, is that it doesn't mean that every country should pursue a vaccine producing future. The study describes the need for a regional strategy, and I was part of a recent ESCAP discussion on this topic, looking at vaccine manufacturing in the Eastern and South Asian region. And there it was pretty definitively put forward empirically that the case for a regional approach and not a national approach, since the technological capacities, the technician knowledge, they're all still relatively scarce. And it does make much more sense to consolidate these regionally. But then it also means, in the report, your study kind of acknowledges this, the need for robust equity agreements at a regional level. And of course, that might then in turn require regional agreements to amend whatever WTO or free trade agreement rules might presently get in the way. Now, I want to conclude by just kind of looking at a few, as it were, big questions that the study poses. So though COVID stimulated many government interventions and overrode their trade and investment treaty obligations, does this really indicate a willingness now to depart from these rules? Or are these rules still so deeply entrenched, creating ideologically supported and very powerful path dependencies, with any lessons from the pandemic, kind of like in terms of the one of reasserting the prime role of the state, that will be quickly forgotten? And the big issue for me behind that question is how the rise of private, corporate, and financialized investor power, empirically and in terms of control over wealth and income, politically in the reframe of stakeholder or inclusive capitalism, and the growth in private sector influences in global governance forums with little oversight of private conflicts of interest. And I think these trends, I actually fear, they imperil any semblance of public interest or inclusive or participatory democracy. And to me, the under the radar issue is really how the pandemic has served the political and power interests of a disturbingly large and growing number of autocratic leaders. And that increases, of course, the risk of geopolitical conflicts on a scale not seen in decades, but also with new digital weapons that can cause more dangerously lethal outcomes than conventional weapons, Russia's invasion of the Ukraine notwithstanding. So to me, the next generation issue is really, if we can't reform trade and investment rules to create more global income and wealth equity and respect global climate commitments, the prospect of achieving a renewed multilateralism based on ensuring that economic activities remain with ecosystem limits doesn't look good in the short term. The struggle to try to make it look good still remains. So I don't really want to end solely on that rather pessimistic note. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Ronald. There's a lot, obviously, very much in your comments on multiple levels, and I think that set us up for a very interesting discussion. I want to reiterate our invitation to please submit questions to the question and answer box. They can be answered directly by some of the panelists if they may wish to. We can also open the mics then for them to discuss them. So please put your questions in the question and answer box. Meanwhile, Carlos, over to you.
Thank you very much, Veronica. Thank you for inviting the South Center to participate in this webinar. As you know, the South Center is following very closely developments in the area of trade, intellectual property, health, investment. So we really welcome the report. It's an excellent report. It's a timely report. It's very comprehensive, as already been mentioned. And it covers 3 developed countries and 3 developing countries. So it really contains very useful empirical information. I will make 3 observations based on some of the main findings and of the report, and I will just try to make a couple of concluding remarks since the time allocated is really very short. So the first comment relates to one of the issues which are actually very well reflected in this report, and this is that developed countries have made extensive use of state intervention. This is quite interesting because the United States, for instance, in the context of the World Trade Organization, is pushing for the narrative that more market economy should be there. As you may recall, there was even a proposal in order to put some limits for non-market economies. Certainly, this was clearly targeted against China. But this is quite surprising because if you look at the information provided by the report, the United States was in fact the most active government in intervention in the context of COVID-19, in particular through subsidies, as it is well noted in the report, developing countries which were considered had not the fiscal space in order to do that, but the United States made the vast use of this. So the highest number of interventions, of almost 500 interventions, took place in the United States. And it's very interesting because if you look at what the United States government has done, they have made use of an old law, the US Defense Production Act, which allowed them to finance the vaccines developers. They allow them to force Johnson & Johnson to share technology with Merck, also in the context of COVID-19 vaccines. They use this law in order to accelerate the manufacture of hardware, the bioreactors, which were needed also in the context of COVID-19, and many other things. It will be interesting to know whether there are many other governments in the world which have got similar powers as compared to the powers that the US administration has in situations like this. So the second comment relates to investment. It is noted that Germany and France, they adopted some additional screening rules for foreign direct investment. In the case of Germany for medical devices and in the case of France for biotech sector. So the question I'd like to pose is whether these measures were actually justified by the COVID-19 crisis, or these are part of the growing trend that we see in developed countries to restrict foreign direct investment. Again, China may be the main target because there is the fear in these countries that China may be aiming at catching up technologically through the acquisition of firms, as South Korea did in the past. But it is clearly one reflection of this trend towards restricting foreign direct investment. In my view, is not necessarily related to COVID-19. And it's also a reflection of the growing nationalistic trends in these countries and the search for more autonomy. So it's quite interesting that during this COVID-19 crisis, United States and the European Union, they realized that they were over-dependent in the area of pharmaceuticals, including active ingredients, in particular from China and India. Then, as you may have seen, now there are new policies, both in the European Union and the United States, in order to regain autonomy, and in some cases also leadership in this area. And it's also quite telling, the example of semiconductors, in which there are massive promised investments in the United States. The so-called Chips for American Act is promising $52 billion in subsidies for the industry, plus $45 billion to strengthen the supply chain. There are similar initiatives in the European Union. So this means that whether it was COVID-19 that was a wake-up call, or whether this is just reflection of trends that were already there, it is quite clear that we will see more and more interventionists from the state in developed countries, in complete contradiction with the narrative they present to the rest of the world. They say government should be out, this should be just a market-led economy. So it's quite interesting that this is going on, and I think we need to continue to monitor this development. So the third comment is about some recommendations that the report is making. The report is essentially saying, and this was also mentioned by Ronald very eloquently, there is a need to reform. There is a need to change institutions and rules. But if you look at what the WTO is discussing now in the context of what was called the Walker process, they are just discussing the adoption of a declaration, which will not change anything, and also discussing a possible action plan. So if you look at the text as developed, which reflects to a great deal the so-called Ottawa group interest in this declaration and action plan, so we see that in the end, the major target of this declaration seems to be to open the markets. And this was expressed in Article 1.2 of the proposed declaration, where the members recognize the necessity of keeping markets open. So it seems further liberalization, which is the main objective of this declaration. If you look at what is there in terms of intellectual property, of course, the waiver is not recognized there, but rather you find in the action plan a very interesting sentence saying that there is a recognition of the role of intellectual property in ensuring the development and equitable distribution of health technologies. So we are recognizing that intellectual property had a positive role in the development and equality in distribution of vaccines. So this is clearly very much against the line that the report is suggesting, and it's quite paradoxical also that only Germany and France adopted legislation to make it easier the use of compulsory license. This was not the case of the three developing countries were considered study. This was the case, however, of Brazil, as you may know. Brazil adopted legislation for the use of compulsory license in the case of emergency, but not the three countries studied in the report, perhaps because these countries had the expectation that the waiver would be adopted. As it was already mentioned, this has not happened. Of course, as is also mentioned in the report, WTO members have the possibility of using the national security exceptions, including under Article 73B of the TRIPS agreement, and this is still an option which is open, and perhaps countries should look at this if the waiver is not adopted. So last two concluding remarks, if I still have a few minutes. The first one is that I cannot agree more with one of the conclusions of the report on page 35, where it is said that the ability of governments to act in the public interest should be acknowledged and given preference over rules favoring private commercial interests. So this is quite clear what should be done, but there is a need, as it was mentioned, to reform many of the disciplines of the trade system and the investment system as well. And certainly I fully agree with the recommendation that there is a need to renegotiate or withdraw from the investor-state dispute mechanism, which is so damaging for developing countries. And then my last comment relates to the tension that the report identifies between the measures adopted and the WTO rules themselves. So it is suggested that in many cases there was inconsistency or a potential inconsistency with the measure, for instance, specific subsidies, that's quite clear, and the rules of the WTO. But for those who are not familiar with the WTO system, maybe it will be surprising to know that although the rules are binding and although there is an enforcement mechanism, the WTO is a very, very special animal because there is no automatic inconsistency that can be declared. In order for an inconsistency to be declared, there is a need for a complaint by a particular member. And if this inconsistency is found, it will only benefit, for instance, in terms of retaliation to the complaining party and not to all the membership. And the WTO operates on the basis of legal considerations and political considerations. So it is very likely that during the COVID-19 period, there was more tolerance in relation to measures that were inconsistent with the WTO rules. A question is made in the report whether these may continue or not after COVID-19, in particular in relation to subsidies or to local content. This may not be the case. But for instance, I will not mention which country this is, but it's interesting that one member of WTO has not granted pharmaceutical patents for more than 10 years. And there has been no complaint against this country, although it's quite clear an obligation to grant patents pharmaceuticals. But there is this political filter that is applied in the system. So finally, I fully agree, there is a need to look at the reform of these disciplines. For instance, the TRIPS agreement, in my view, is one of the most damaging. It is interesting that India introduced local content disciplines. This should be reviewed. And there is a provision for the review of the TRIPS agreement, which has never been triggered. And therefore, I fully agree with this line. In order to get a system which is actually fair, we need to look at not just that the flexibilities. Interestingly, in this Walker process, the wording used in the proposed declaration action plan is to look at how the flexibilities in WTO system can be used. But this is not enough. We need to change the rules if we want to get a system which operates in a different manner for development. Thank you much again for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Carlos, for very comprehensive remarks. We really appreciate that. The 3 remarks on the report, the 3 reflecting remarks, I think all very, very well appreciated. I see 2 questions by the audience in the chat, one from Bella: what type of reforms to the Bretton Woods liberal institutions is needed, and which countries are shaping discussions about reforming? And a very similar questions from Tani: which countries will take the lead in confronting the global corporate interest in the WTO? So it looks here up to leadership and a question on leadership on these reforms. So Sandra and Rachel, I wanted to give you the opportunity to address some of these questions, but also maybe responding to Ronald and Carlos. Can I ask you to be brief because I see that the time is nearly up. So maybe Sandra, you want to start us off and then Rachel follows. Sandra, can I ask you to unmute, please?
Really reflecting on comments that have been made both by Ronald and by Carlos, we are not naive about the amount of effort and the low likelihood that these kinds of reforms can be made. And yet we felt that it was a useful exercise to lay out the specific kinds of reforms that would not only respond to the deficiencies in the current global trade and investment regime, but also that would try to take advantage of the contradiction or the contrast between what governments agreed to at the WTO in '95, as Ronald says, during a very pro-market neoliberal perspective, and what they actually did when they were confronted with a crisis. That opens at least an intellectual space to point out the deficiencies and the contradictions in the current regime. And I think it's worth noting, and Carlos certainly knows and has written about this, that the critique of the WTO has gone on almost from the beginning among developing countries, that the rules were written not just to favor markets over governments and to restrict the action of governments, but the rules were written to favor the big powers, to favor the companies of the big powers. And so when we look at a rule like the one that I mentioned, that say a developing country that wants to build its pharmaceutical industry can be challenged if the growth of that pharmaceutical industry has adverse impacts on existing market share of companies in other countries. That clearly redounds to the benefit of the already developed world. So we are not, as I say, we're not naive about how easy it is for this to happen. In terms of who will lead, I think we can see different coalitions on this. I think we may see different coalitions emerging. For example, at the WTO, the discussion of subsidies at the WTO, as Ronald mentioned, before the crisis, had a group of countries that were pressing for very strong, much stronger disciplines on subsidies, which were seen as a way of disciplining non-market economies. Given the extensive use of subsidies by the 3 developed countries in our study and many others, clearly that position is going to have to change somewhat, because otherwise they will be strengthening disciplines that will lead them to legal challenges to each other. And to say that because one country did it, they won't challenge another, one only needs to look at the large commercial aircraft disputes that went on for 20 years between Boeing and Airbus. That's not the case at all, that you won't have a conflict because by 2 countries doing it, they'll look the other way. So I can't say who is going to lead, but I do think that there probably is an opportunity for some dynamism in the forming of coalitions around this, because a number of governments were very scarred by the experience. And I think in terms of their own domestic political standing and their domestic politics, may be more amenable to taking what you might call the pro-human position here.
I will hand it over now to Rachel for some concluding remarks.
Thank you, Veronica. Thanks, Ronald and Carlos and Sandra, for all these amazing comments. I don't think I can add much more to the previous question than what Sandra said. Kevin Gallagher, our director at the GDP Center, posted a question that I think is important to note. He asked, if these measures were taken, does it mean that we have enough flexibility? There have been no WTO cases, or not very many that we know of yet brought, and certainly none decided at this point. And I think it's important for us to note that that there's a time scale here. We have yet to see what will happen in disputes, both in investor-state disputes, which has come up a number of times, and in WTO disputes, which may come up later. At this point, the appellate body is not able to operate, and so once potentially that gets up and running, that we may see an uptick in disputes. So I think there's something we can it's too early to see whether or not we have enough. Certainly, we would argue there isn't enough flexibility, but also I just think so much of this discussion about reform has a short time scale view, and what we really need to start thinking about is the longer time scale of what tiny changes can we make and promote over time. And I think we've seen an increase in interest in investor-state dispute reform, and in countries and civil society wanting to eschew it. And I think that gives us hope that will be the trajectory that we go towards in terms of reforming many of these institutions. But it may take some time. So with that, I'll finish.
Thank you so much. We have come to the end of our session. I would like to thank all the panelists. First, Rachel, Sandra, for the excellent presentation, and also our panelists, Ronald and Carlos. A really fascinating discussion. We invite you to send us your comments also via email to the Global Development Policy Center, and also our next event. Please check out our website. Thank you very much.